Nobody in that restaurant realized they were only seconds away from witnessing a moment that could erase the greatest career in music history. To everyone else, it looked like another romantic evening. The king of rock and roll had reserved the finest table in one of Los Angeles's most luxurious hotels. A beautiful woman sat across from him. Candles glowed between them. Rain painted silver lines across the giant windows overlooking the city. A pianist filled the room with a slow melody that sounded almost too beautiful to be real. It looked like a proposal. But no one, not the waiter pouring wine, not the pianist touching the ivory keys, not the wealthy guests whispering over expensive dinners, not even the woman sitting across from Elvis Presley, knew what was truly at stake. Hidden inside the inner pocket of Elvis's black tailored jacket rested a small velvet ring box. And hidden even deeper was a handwritten letter. A letter no one had ever seen.
A letter that began with only one sentence.
If she says no, I am done. Not done with the relationship, done with everything. The concert, the spotlight, Hollywood, the interviews, the screaming crowds, the endless tours. The legend called Elvis Presley. Tomorrow night, more than 20,000 people would fill the biggest arena in Los Angeles just to hear him sing. Television networks were already preparing their cameras. Journalists had called it the performance of the year. Fans had traveled across the country. Some had sold their jewelry just to buy a ticket. Children carried homemade signs. Mothers had waited in lines since dawn. Teenagers believed seeing Elvis perform would become the greatest memory of their entire lives. But none of them knew. Their hero had already made his decision. If the woman sitting across from him whispered one simple word, no, tomorrow's concert would never happen. The lights would never come on. The curtain would never rise. The band would wait backstage for a singer who would never arrive. Millions would wonder why. Only one woman would know the answer. Because sometimes, the loudest applause in the world cannot heal the silence inside one lonely heart. Rain struck the enormous windows harder now. Lightning briefly illuminated the city skyline before disappearing into darkness. For a moment, the restaurant became completely silent. Even the storm outside seemed to be waiting. Elvis slowly looked down at his hands. They were shaking, not slightly, violently. These were the same hands that had held microphones before oceans of screaming fans. The same hands that had signed thousands of autographs without hesitation. The same hands that had confidently greeted presidents, actors, musicians, world champions, and kings. Yet, tonight, they could barely hold a coffee cup. He quietly wrapped both hands around it, hoping she wouldn't notice. She did.
You've barely touched your dinner.
Her voice was soft, gentle, nothing like the voices constantly demanding something from him. He forced a smile. I guess I'm not very hungry. She leaned forward slightly. Elvis. There was concern in her eyes, real concern. Not curiosity, not admiration, not fascination. Concern. Are you all right? He wanted to answer. He truly did. But how could he explain what was happening inside him? How could he tell her that the entire future of the most famous man on earth rested inside a single word she hadn't even spoken yet? Instead, he smiled again, a smile so practiced that millions believed it meant happiness. Only she could tell it didn't. I've just been thinking. She reached across the table and gently placed her hand over his. That single touch stopped every storm inside him. It amazed Elvis how something so small could accomplish what roaring crowds never could. Her hand wasn't trying to hold on to Elvis Presley.
It was reaching for Elvis. Just Elvis. Not the icon, not the superstar. The man. Sometimes he wondered if she even realized how rare that was. Ever since fame had exploded into his life, almost every conversation began with the same expression.
Oh my God, you're Elvis Presley.
People stared, people screamed, people cried, people asked for signatures, photographs, songs, favors, stories. Everybody wanted a piece of him. Very few ever asked whether he was tired, or lonely, or afraid. She had. On the very first day they met, not, "Can I have your autograph?" Not, "Can you sing my favorite song?" Instead, she had quietly asked, "Do you ever get to be yourself?" He remembered freezing. Nobody had ever asked him that. Not once. That single question had followed him for weeks, because he didn't know the answer. Did he ever get to be himself? Or had Elvis Presley become a character he played every day until he no longer remembered where the performance ended?
He looked at her now. She smiled softly.
You disappeared again.
What?
You've been staring through the window for almost a full minute.
Oh. He laughed quietly. I didn't even notice.
You've been doing that a lot lately.
I know.
Is something worrying you?
Everything. Absolutely everything. His career, his family, his future, the pressure, the expectations, the loneliness, the fear that one day people would stop cheering, the fear that success had become a prison built entirely from applause. Most of all, the fear that the one woman capable of saving him might not choose him. Not the legend, not the singer, just the man. He wanted to tell her everything. Instead, he simply whispered, "I've never been this scared before." She frowned. "You?" He nodded. "The man who walks onto stages in front of thousands." He smiled sadly. "That man isn't scared." She looked confused. "Then who is?" He answered so quietly that only she could hear. "Me." She squeezed his hand tighter. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Words suddenly felt too small. Outside, rain continued falling. Inside, the pianist changed melodies. The new tune was slower, warmer, almost heartbreakingly beautiful. A waiter carrying crystal glasses slowed as he passed their table. Something felt different tonight. Even he could sense it. Other guests began glancing toward Elvis, not because he was famous, because something in his face looked heavy, as if he had been carrying invisible weight for years. And perhaps he had. Being Elvis Presley looked magical from the outside. Inside, it was exhausting. Every headline demanded perfection. Every performance had to be greater than the last. Every smile had to look effortless. Every mistake became front-page news. There were days he no longer remembered what silence sounded like, except when he was with her. She never asked him to perform. She never asked him to impress her. She never asked him to become larger than life. She simply allowed him to exist. That was why tonight terrified him. Because losing her would mean losing the last place where Elvis Presley stopped existing. And Elvis the man finally began.
He slipped one hand into his jacket. His fingers touched the velvet box. Cold, solid, real. His heartbeat immediately doubled. He could hear it, feel it, almost see it. He closed his eyes. His mother's voice echoed somewhere inside his memory. "Son, one day you'll stand before thousands without fear. But the hardest courage you'll ever need is the courage to let one person see your heart." He had been a boy when she said those words. Back then, he hadn't understood them. Now, they felt painfully true. He slowly opened his eyes again. Across the table, she smiled, completely unaware that she was holding the future of the most famous entertainer alive in the palm of her hand. Then, something unexpected happened. The restaurant doors opened. A cold gust of rain-filled air swept inside. Every head turned. A man wearing a soaked gray overcoat hurried into the restaurant. He wasn't looking for a table. He wasn't looking at the menu. His eyes searched the room desperately until they landed on Elvis. The stranger froze. Then, without asking permission, he began walking straight toward their table. His face was pale, his breathing uneven, and in his trembling hand, he carried an old envelope with Elvis's full name written across the front. Every instinct inside Elvis suddenly screamed that this night was about to become something far bigger than a marriage proposal. He had planned to ask the most important question of his life. Instead, fate had arrived first. The entire restaurant fell silent. The stranger stopped only a few steps away from Elvis. Rainwater dripped from the brim of his hat onto the polished marble floor. His gray overcoat was soaked, and every breath escaped his lips in short, uneven bursts. In his trembling hand was an old cream-colored envelope, its edges worn by time, its paper stained by years of being opened and closed. Across the front, written in elegant blue ink, were only 3 words: Elvis Aaron Presley. For several seconds, nobody moved. The pianist's fingers remained suspended above the keys. The waiters froze in place. Even the candles seemed to burn without flickering. Elvis slowly stood. His instincts told him this was no coincidence. "Can I help you?" he asked gently. The stranger swallowed hard. I've been looking for you for years," his voice cracked. "I promised someone I'd put this letter into your hands, and only your hands." Elvis glanced at the envelope. "Who sent it?" The man's eyes filled with sadness. "I can't answer that." "You don't know?" "Oh, I know." He lowered his head. "But I gave my word." Silence. The stranger slowly extended the envelope. "It was meant to be opened on the day you decided who would spend the rest of your life beside you." Elvis felt a chill race through his body. No one knew what he had planned tonight. Not even Colonel Parker. Not his band, not his closest friends. So how could this stranger possibly know? The woman beside him looked at the envelope, then back at Elvis. "Do you know him?" Elvis slowly shook his head. "No. I've never seen him before." The stranger gave a faint smile. "No. But your mother did." The world stopped. Elvis's heartbeat echoed in his ears. "My mother?" The stranger nodded. Gladys Presley. Hearing her name spoken by a complete stranger made Elvis's chest tighten. His mother had been gone for years, yet somehow, tonight, she suddenly felt closer than ever. Elvis carefully accepted the envelope. His fingers trembled. The paper felt unbelievably fragile, as though one careless movement could erase whatever secret had waited inside for years. The woman quietly reached for his arm. "You don't have to open it now." He looked into her eyes, then back at the envelope. Something deep inside him whispered otherwise. "No." "I think I do." He slowly broke the old wax seal. The sound was barely audible, yet it echoed through the silent restaurant like thunder. Inside rested a single folded letter. Nothing else. No photographs, no money, no signatures. Only words. Elvis unfolded it carefully. The handwriting immediately caught his attention. Elegant, gentle, familiar, painfully familiar. His breathing stopped. He recognized it instantly. His mother's handwriting. His lips parted. "No," he whispered so quietly that only the woman beside him heard. "It can't be." The first line read, "My dear Elvis." His vision blurred. For a long moment, he simply stared at the page. His eyes refused to move. His heart refused to believe what they were seeing. The room disappeared. The restaurant disappeared. The rain disappeared. Everything vanished except those 3 words. "My dear Elvis." A tear rolled down his cheek before he even realized he was crying. The woman gently touched his shoulder. "Elvis?" He looked at her. His voice barely existed. This is my mother's handwriting." She covered her mouth in disbelief. "What?" "I would recognize it anywhere." He closed his eyes. Memories flooded back without warning. A tiny house in Tupelo, the smell of fresh biscuits in the morning, his mother's warm embrace before church, the way she smiled whenever he sang. The nights she whispered that no matter how famous he became, he should never let the world harden his heart. Years had passed since she was gone, yet somehow, tonight, it felt as though she had walked back into his life. With trembling hands, Elvis continued reading. "If these words have reached you, then life has carried you farther than I ever imagined. I pray you have become the man I always believed you could be." Elvis swallowed. Another tear followed. "The world will cheer for your voice, but never mistake applause for love. They are not the same thing." His chest tightened. Those words struck him harder than any headline ever had. Because they were true. Painfully true. The crowd loved what he represented, but very few people truly knew him. He continued, "One day you will sit across from a woman who makes the noise of the world disappear." Elvis looked across the table. Their eyes met. The woman didn't speak. She simply smiled through tears. He returned to the letter. "If your heart feels peaceful beside her, if you are able to forget that you are Elvis Presley even for a single moment." He paused. His hands shook harder. "Then don't let fear steal your future." The restaurant remained perfectly silent. Even strangers who couldn't hear the words somehow understood they were witnessing something sacred. The pianist quietly removed his hands from the keyboard. Nobody wanted music. The silence itself had become music. Elvis turned to the final paragraph. His breathing grew slower, his heartbeat louder. "My son, fame fades. Beauty changes. Success comes and goes. But genuine love is the only home a restless heart will ever find. Another tear landed on the page. He carefully brushed it away before the ink could blur. Then, he reached the last sentence, the sentence that completely broke him. When you finally ask her to spend forever with you, don't kneel as the king of rock and roll. Kneel as the little boy who once held his mother's hand and dreamed of finding someone who would love him exactly as he was. Elvis could no longer hold back his emotions. He lowered the letter, covered his face,
and quietly wept. Not as a legend, not as an icon, not as Elvis Presley. Simply as a son who missed his mother. The woman slowly stood from her chair. Without saying a word, she wrapped both arms around him. He rested his forehead against hers. Neither of them cared that the entire restaurant was watching. Some moments were too honest to hide. Across the room, several guests quietly wiped tears from their own eyes. The elderly waiter who had served them blinked repeatedly, trying to compose himself. The pianist lowered his head. No melody could ever equal what was unfolding before him. After several minutes, Elvis finally lifted his head. He looked toward the stranger, but the man was gone. The restaurant doors gently swayed as rain blew inside. He had disappeared into the storm without a word. The waiter hurried outside. He searched the sidewalk, the street, the parking area. Nothing. It was as if the stranger had vanished into the rain itself. Only wet footprints remained on the marble floor. Elvis stared toward the empty doorway, still holding the letter tightly against his chest. One question echoed through his mind. Who had kept this letter safe all these years? And why had fate chosen this exact night to return his mother's final words? He slowly turned back toward the woman he loved. His eyes were still red from crying. His hands still trembled. The velvet ring box remained inside his jacket. But now, the proposal was no longer only about love. It had become a promise to the little boy his mother had raised, a promise to the woman standing before him, and a promise that no amount of fame would ever be greater than the family he dreamed of building. He took one slow breath, then another. Finally, he reached into his jacket. His fingers closed around the velvet box once again. This time, they were no longer shaking. Elvis closed his eyes for a single moment. The restaurant disappeared. The applause that had followed him for years disappeared. The cameras, the headlines, the endless expectations. Everything faded into silence. Only one heartbeat remained, his own, and one pair of eyes, looking back at him with quiet love. He slowly removed the small velvet box from inside his jacket. The deep red fabric seemed almost alive beneath the candlelight. For a second, he simply held it, not opening it, not speaking, only breathing. The woman standing before him watched every movement, sensing that this was no ordinary proposal. This was a man placing his entire future into another person's hands. Elvis took one step closer, then another. Finally, he lowered himself onto one knee. No one in the restaurant moved. Crystal glasses remained untouched. Forks rested on porcelain plates. The pianist quietly stood from his bench,
removing his hands from the piano as if even music would disturb this moment. Outside, rain continued falling. Inside, time itself seemed to stop. Elvis looked into her eyes. For the first time that evening, there was no fear, only truth. His voice was soft, almost fragile. I've spent years trying to become someone the whole world would remember. He paused. And somewhere along the way, I forgot how badly I wanted to simply become someone's home. A tear slipped down her cheek. Elvis smiled gently. I've stood beneath brighter lights than I ever dreamed possible. I've heard crowds so loud they made the ground shake. I've held trophies, broken records, lived dreams that little boys only imagine. But every single one of those moments ended. The applause always faded. The lights always went dark. The crowds always went home. He looked down at the letter still resting in his hand. My mother once told me that if I ever found the person who made me forget I was Elvis Presley, I should never let fear take her away. He slowly opened the velvet box. A brilliant diamond reflected the candlelight. The entire restaurant seemed to glow. He looked back into her eyes. So tonight, I'm not asking you as the king of rock and roll. I'm asking you as the little boy who still believes love is the greatest gift God can give. His voice trembled. I don't know what tomorrow looks like. I don't know how many songs I'll sing. I don't know how many stages I'll stand on. But I know exactly where I want to wake up every morning. Beside you. He swallowed, then whispered the words that had lived inside his heart for months. Will you marry me? Silence. Not ordinary silence. The kind of silence that changes lives. She stared at him, then at the ring, then back into his eyes. Her lips parted, but no words came. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Every heartbeat inside Elvis felt louder than thunder. A waiter quietly closed his eyes. An elderly couple across the room reached for each other's hands. Even strangers found themselves praying for a happy ending. Elvis smiled sadly, not because he had lost hope, because he had finally understood something. Love could never be forced. It could only be given. If her answer was no, he would still love her enough to accept it. Then, she slowly stepped closer. Instead of answering, she gently placed both hands against his face. Her thumbs wiped away the tears he had tried so hard to hide. She smiled through tears of her own. I fell in love with a man, she whispered. Not a legend. Not a superstar. Not the world's greatest performer. Just you. Another tear rolled down Elvis's cheek. She laughed softly. The funny thing is, I was planning to ask you something tonight, too. Elvis blinked in surprise. What? She reached into her purse. The entire restaurant watched in confusion. She pulled out a small folded piece of paper. It was old. Its edges were worn from being opened many times. She handed it to him. What is this? I wrote it months ago. He slowly unfolded it. Inside were only a few handwritten lines. If one day Elvis asks me to marry him, My answer will already be yes. Because I don't want forever with the world's biggest star. I only want forever with the man who still blushes when he gets nervous. Elvis laughed through tears. The entire restaurant laughed softly with him. She looked into his eyes one final time, then spoke the word he had dreamed about every night. Yes. A single word. Yet somehow, it sounded more beautiful than every song he had ever sung. Elvis closed his eyes. Relief flooded through him like sunlight after a storm. His hands trembled once more, but this time, not from fear, from happiness. He carefully slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. At that exact moment, the restaurant erupted. Applause filled every corner of the room. People stood from their tables. Some wiped tears from their faces. Others embraced complete strangers. The pianist smiled, sat back down, and quietly began playing Can't Help Falling in Love. No one had asked him to. It simply felt right. The melody drifted through the room as Elvis stood. The woman immediately wrapped her arms around him. He held her tightly, not wanting the moment to end. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. They simply stood together while the world celebrated around them. Outside, the rain slowly stopped. Clouds drifted apart. Moonlight finally broke through the darkness. A single beam of silver light reached the restaurant window. Elvis looked toward the sky. Almost instinctively, he placed one hand over the letter from his mother. Very quietly, so quietly that no one else heard, he whispered, "I hope I made you proud, Mom." A gentle breeze touched the window. Nothing more. Yet somehow, he smiled, because deep inside, it felt like an answer. The next evening, more than 20,000 people filled the arena. The lights dimmed, the crowd roared louder than ever before. Backstage, managers searched frantically for Elvis. Musicians tuned their instruments. The announcer waited for his cue. Then, Elvis walked toward the stage. But something was different. His smile no longer looked rehearsed. His shoulders no longer carried invisible weight. For the first time in years, he wasn't walking onto that stage searching for approval. He was walking toward it, already complete. As the curtain opened, the audience exploded with deafening cheers. Elvis stepped into the spotlight. He looked briefly toward the front row, where the woman wearing a brand new diamond ring smiled back at him. He smiled too, then leaned toward the microphone. Before singing a single note, he quietly said, "Tonight, I finally learned something. The greatest sound in the world isn't applause. It's hearing the person you love say, 'Yes.'" The arena fell silent, then erupted into thunderous applause, not because the king had spoken, but because every person in that building understood the truth hidden inside those words. Years later, people would remember the concert. They would remember the songs. They would remember the headlines. But those who had been inside that quiet restaurant on the rainy evening would remember something else. They would remember seeing the most famous man in the world become, for just a little while, the happiest. Because legends are remembered for what they achieve, but they are loved for the moments when they allow themselves to be human.